Good evening, and welcome to Spelman Speaks, a series on Black Lives Matter and social justice. Please welcome the 10th president of Spelman College, Dr. Mary Smith Campbell.
Good evening. I'm Mary Schmidt Campbell, and as the 10th president of Spelman College, I'm pleased to welcome you to Spelman Speaks, a series on Black Lives Matter and social justice. Thank you for joining us for the first in a series of monthly town hall style discussions developed to create a space for our community to stay in dialogue as we continue to advocate for equity and equality within our local, national, and global communities. Tonight, we're joined by moderator Rose Scott, an award-winning journalist and the host of Closer Look with Rose Scott on WABE, Atlanta's NPR affiliate. We are delighted to have her serve as moderator for the inaugural discussion in our series. I couldn't think of a better person to lead our guests through a conversation on the complex social web engineered by systemic and structural racism. During tonight's discussion, a member of the Spelman faculty will join one of our students, a social justice fellow, a renowned alumna, and a national expert for a conversation on the ways in which we can continue to disentangle the suppressive tactics and ideological frames constructed by white supremacy. As a historically Black women's college, our very founding was a statement that Black lives matter. Through conversations like Spelman Speaks, we hope to offer intersectional scholarly commentary, insights, and analyses that address this current moment of social unrest. Our conversation tonight comes at a somber time. We just lost a mighty warrior, a courageous soldier in the fight for justice. With heavy hearts, we mourn the death of Georgia Congressman John Lewis. On behalf of the trustees, faculty, students, staff, and alumni of Spelman College, I extend my heartfelt condolences to his family and loved ones. Let's pause now for a moment of silence in honor of Congressman John Lewis. Thank you. Spelman intends to honor Representative Lewis with a scholarship in his name. We intend to support annually 5 students who are carrying on his legacy through their academic pursuits and social activism. Now, at this historic moment, as we navigate turbulent waters, we draw inspiration and courage from John Lewis's decades of selfless sacrifice. Congressman Lewis reminds us of the countless elders and family members who, like him, have also remained steadfast in their commitment to equity and justice for all. As a prelude to tonight's conversation, we're going to hear the words of one of those elders. Her story is brought to us through our Spelman Independent Scholars Program, directed by Dr. Gloria Wade Gales. Spelman students who participate in Dr. Gales' program record interviews with elders who sometimes recall the brutality of racism of the past. Let's hear the words now of Mary Tigner as she reflects on her observations as a child and the virulence of racism.
Everybody knew what they did. They come, get you out, beat you, and leave you somewhere. The more I think about it, the more they don't have everything in them history books. The books out there don't have the whole story. They don't have everything. In our town, there's a big park in the center of the park. They lynched a Negro in that park. That's Marietta, Georgia. After the lynching, birds came to the park by the thousands. Nobody could sit in it anymore. That park is still there. It has seats, and in the center is a water fountain, a beautiful fountain. Blacks couldn't even go in the park back then. My grandmother told me when they lynched that man in the park, that black man, the birds came. Nobody could sit in the park. Birds came by the thousands.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And also thank you, Madam President. You know, since March, I've been saying the phrase, what an extraordinary time we're all in. First pandemic, then protests, it's an election year, so politics. And at the intersection of all of this, well, it's we the people. And so this evening, we, some of the people, have an opportunity to exchange ideas, reflections, and maybe even offer some possible solutions to the current climate of our nation. And what an amazing panel to be in conversation with as Spelman kicks off this series on Black Lives Matter and social justice. And so I am honored to introduce our panel. And I'm going to start with the future, or as we call them, the young folk. We're going to start with Sophia Howard. She's a senior comparative women's studies major and philosophy minor from Nashville, Tennessee. And she studied extensively the intersection of white supremacy and patriarchy through the reproductive rights of incarcerated women. And through this study, she's created Unlocked Minds. It's a book club in Whitworth Women's Facility. It's a minimum and medium security prison in Hartwell, Georgia, and in her support and advocacy for incarcerated people. Also, Dr. Bernice King. If you don't know this name, I don't know where you've been. She's considered a global thought leader. She is a global thought leader, an orator, a peace advocate, and CEO of the King Center, which was founded by her mother, Coretta Scott King. And through her lens and from this position, the same one held by her mother, Dr. King continues to advance her parents' legacy of a Kingian nonviolence, which she rebranded Nonviolence 365. And oh yeah, she's a proud alumna, class of, I'm not gonna say it. Also we have, who knew a hashtag would soon become a global movement, Patrisse Cullors. Artist, organizer, educator, popular public speaker. And she's a Los Angeles native and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network and founder of the grassroots Los Angeles-based organization, Dignity and Power Now. And also, Dr. Danielle Dickens, an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Spelman. She's also a co-founder of Beneath the Facade. It's a website that serves as a psychoeducational resource and digital community for Black women, coping with stereotypical expectations and gendered racism. And by the way, also a proud Spelman alumna. Thank you all. I'm very proud to be part of this conversation. Thank you all for being part of this. Welcome. You know, President Campbell talked about a giant that we recently lost in Congressman John Lewis, and also another titan in Reverend C.T. Vivian. And for me, what I've noticed about these two extraordinary individuals and all of those during the civil rights movement was the importance of young people being involved. And so this is my first question I want all of you to sort of chime in on, which is the importance of intergenerational discussions about social justice advocacy. And Dr. King, I'm gonna let you kick off that part of the answer. The importance of generations coming together.
You know, when I think about that, I think about my mother's words where she says, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. I think what she was essentially saying to us is that the freedom struggle connects us from generation to generation, and that we have a responsibility to build upon the previous generation and to continue to advance a pathway for those that will come behind. And in that process, there are multiple generations that have to rise to the occasion. Oftentimes when I use this quote, I say to people, it's when she says you have to earn it and win it in every generation, she's not necessarily speaking of an age grouping. She's speaking of intergenerations coming together in the time period that they exist on this earth to create a more just, humane, and peaceful world. And so I think it's highly critical because there are things that we can extract from the past to help us in our current struggle. Those our elders, in other words. We can extract things from the John Lewis's and the C.T. Vivians, but there's a strength and a courage and a tenacity within the younger generation that is so important to the movement for freedom.
Professor Dickens, what do you think?
And just to add to that, I would say that it's important to have these intergenerational conversations, especially to acknowledge what has done, what worked, what didn't work, and also to acknowledge the people that have paved the way for us to have the rights that we have today. And I think also it provides a space for the conversation for the younger generation to speak to the innovative ways that we can fight injustices. And also, I think it can foster mentorship across the different generations.
Right. Sophia, what about you?
Adding on to what the other panelists have said, I think that another aspect that's really important is this kind of generational burnout that I think can happen, of people being weighed down and exhausted by these systems of oppression that have overwhelmed the existence of minorities, especially in this country, especially racial minorities. And so I think that it's really important that there be these intergenerational conversations where, younger people are able to get wisdom, but they're also able to revitalize and give energy oftentimes to things that can feel kind of like run down and exhausted.
Patrice.
I love this question, and I think about it a lot, actually, as someone who is actually trained by folks in the civil rights movement. We were taught very early on that intergenerational relationships were absolutely necessary, and that there have been people who are still alive that have lived through much of what we are experiencing now, and that that wisdom is so important as we chart a way forward. I also think that what we've learned in these last 7 years inside of Black Lives Matter is that generations are going to sometimes conflict and butt heads, and that's a part of the process. And that's fine, and that's okay. And as that happens, what's most important is we figure out points of unity, and we figure out how we show up for each other. This is a long haul fight. When I was 18 years old and joined the movement, I remember saying, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And my mentor saying, we'll see. And 20 plus years later, I'm still here, and it's still a we'll see. It's not easy. This is thankless work. This is work that often in history doesn't have big moments. We're very blessed to be seeing a big moment in history right now, but that's not always how it goes, right? We know as movement leaders that the cameras will turn away soon, and they largely have, to be honest with you, in this moment, and that we will have to keep doing the work to try to push us towards freedom. And that has to happen inside of an intergenerational context. I deeply believe in that. And I think that this is, for my millennials and Gen Zers who are listening, it is incredibly important that we both understand our role as being a generation that has brand new tools that didn't exist even 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but that the old school tools also work. And that we have to be able to blend both technologies in these moments, because when we blend both technologies, we allow for a greater potential and possibility to win.
Patrice, I want to stay with you for a second, because I keep hearing there's this whole narrative around there's something different about this moment. And whether it's because of the tragic killing of George Floyd that we all witnessed, and people saying that that is something different that makes this moment, and that hopefully this will be the time that we sort of get it right, so to speak. But I want to get your thoughts on this moment being different and what it means to you.
I think it is different, and I think it's the same. Because I remember feeling like 2014 was different, with the killing of Mike Brown, and the community
And Dr. King, this awakening that Patrice is talking about, the conversations I'm having with so many people also say it needs to come with reconciliation and acknowledgement from white folks, from those white folks who want to be allies. What's your viewpoint on that, before we can talk about joining in and having this awakening, that there needs to be some acknowledgement and reconciliation of systemic racism in this nation? Is that important to this movement?
I think it's very important, and that's one of the things I was going to add to what Patrice said. Is one of the things that I believe is different in this moment is that there are white people who are talking about white privilege and looking in the mirror and really saying that we have to address this out of their own mouths. I've been privy, because of my relationship, globally with people, to be a part of conversations with members of the white community and see them going through this process of acknowledging this privilege and really feeling that change has to happen and they have to be a part of that change, and acknowledging that they have been on the sidelines and participated in perpetuating these systemic oppressions. And so, if we're going to truly have an alignment, not just of allyship, I think it's really what my father called, we exist in this world house of brother and sisterhood, then we're going to have to really come face to face with the things that threaten all of us. Racism is not the Black racist problem. Racism threatens all of humanity. As he called it, as a part of the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, which in his view and perspective, racism probably was the primary one that we need to eradicate, because it is the inseparable twin of economic injustice. And so I think it's very important that acknowledgement take place, and truths be admitted. Because you can't get to healing and reconciliation in the absence of that, and that justice be established, because those have to precede the process of reconciliation.
Professor Dickens, when we talk about this process of reconciliation and acknowledgement, and particularly from white folks, and then sometimes often you'll hear, well, you're making me feel guilty or you're blaming me for things I had nothing to do. How do you suggest navigating through those conversations so that white folks can not rely so much on the white guilt aspect and get past that and really work on the reconciliation process and then become part of this global movement that everyone's talking about?
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to, as what was previously mentioned, that they have to do the work themselves as well. And in terms of getting past through that white fragility, right, and sensitivity as it relates to these conversations surrounding race. And I think also some other research suggests that one of the ways that one can reduce prejudice and negative beliefs about someone because they belong to a particular group is called cognitive empathy. The idea of imagining how someone, taking on someone else's perspective. And I think that's what we're seeing potentially now with why there may be more support from the white community, because now they're seeing more videos of what has happened, like of racism and this anti-Black racism particularly. And so I think that's one way. And then also within psychology, we suggest the idea of contact hypothesis. And so this idea of having this consistent personal interaction with people of color, Black and brown people, could potentially change people's negative beliefs about particular racial groups. But it has to be with people that challenge the racial stereotypes that they may have. So those are just a few suggestions.
Sophia, let's talk about, because Patrice mentioned this in terms of there's something that can be gained from each generation. The older generation can learn from the younger generation, vice versa, and sometimes there might be conflict. What do you see the role of your generation being able to add to this current moment that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that I would love to see my generation do, and something that I see my peers already starting to do, is really diving into this intersectional lens and the ways in which we organize and the ways in which we contribute, and being super mindful. I think each generation does it a little bit better than the one before. And we have to continue to acknowledge that in fighting against these systems of oppression, that they work very hard to kind of erode the narratives of further marginalized people. And we have to be very intentional about the people that we put in the forefront of movements and the narratives that we share, right? And so Black bodies, who are queer, Black differently abled bodies, Black trans bodies, all of those identities need to be centered, right? Because when we center the most marginalized, everybody is free. And so I think that my generation needs to be very instrumental and being very intentional about the narratives that we share, and really making sure that we're breaking apart from this very patriarchal, classist, ableist society that we live in, that all help to contribute to the success of white supremacy.
Well, Sophia, let me stay with you, because we've seen and heard conversations about, well, how do we make sure we can include everybody's message? I've heard people say, well, we're talking about Black Lives Matter right now, and we hear Black trans lives matter. We hear, let's also examine Black on Black crime. Let's also examine issues within the Black community. So we have all these issues, right? But is it too much to pack into this single movement, or should we focus on just the police brutality of it? There's so many tentacles tied to all of this. So how do you prioritize?
I think that there's a way to capitalize on a movement and capitalize on momentum and use that momentum to facilitate specific types of change. I think that what we have to be very careful about is this idea of prioritizing certain issues over other issues, right? So we hear lots of things about the police brutality of Black men, right? But we know that the police brutality of Black women and of Black trans folk is also an incredibly big issue. And so whatever part of the movement is going to be honed in on, we have to be intentional and approach it with a radically intersectional framework, because that's not always the case. And even when people are doing that work, and we saw that with Mrs. Colors and, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to give people credit where it's due, right? So Black queer women founded Black Lives Matter. That's an important detail that lots of people either miss or they just don't know. So we know that there's this erasure of Black queer narratives and of Black trans narratives. And if you're anti-racist, then to me, then you're not homophobic, right? If you're for Black lives, then you're for all Black lives. And so excluding a certain sect of Black identity doesn't contribute to freedom.
Patrice, I want to let you chime in on that too, and what Sophia just said.
I agree with everything Sophia just said. I just privately clapped hands to her. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think part of the conversation we had 7 years ago when we started Black Lives Matter was this is a conversation about how we get free as Black people. And we have all types of Black people in our community. And so how do we actually have those are honest and courageous and often hard conversations about who we accept and who we believe deserves dignity and who we believe deserves care. And my values should be and are about all Black lives. And so we've spent a lot of time challenging the idea that we only fight for one group of Black people, or that there's only one type of group of Black people inside that group that's worth fighting for. I think that is something that is, I think a lot about Congressman Lewis, who, had this honest moment and during an interview where he was like, we didn't fight for Bayard Rustin. That was not the belief in that time to do that. And so we are an evolution of our own movement, and that's powerful, that's important. And in 10, 15 years, there will be another evolution of the movement. My hope is that we get this right, that we can in fact protect Black trans women from being murdered over and over again, that we can in fact protect Black cis women from being murdered, that we can in fact create a world where Black people have true safety inside our communities and outside of our communities. And so that, in 20 years, we're having a new conversation around what we need as Black people. We should be evolving every generation. And our politics and our values should be evolving, and we should be allowing ourselves to hear and be willing to be a part of a new context, which is, has a lot to also do with how we understand ourselves as a movement. At the beginning, a lot of people were like, where's the single leader? And we were like, there's no single leader. And in fact, you all have it wrong. There's never been a single leader. There's always been a multitude of leaders. That's how we make change. When people ask me, what can they do individually? You could do a lot of things individually, but if you want to make systemic change, you need to join something. You need to be a part of something. That is a group act. And part of the consequence of American individualism is that we think that one person can change it all. And that's not possible. And that's also a whole lot of pressure for one individual. So what we should be doing is encouraging, thousands of people to be leaders, because that's how you change structures, that's how you change systems. And I think this generation has really challenged this idea that we're, it's going to be one leader, or even the idea that it's leaderless. It's not a leaderless movement, it's a leaderful movement. And you can see that by, who is taking up the mantle every single day. I think the reason why there's been a lot of confusion about Black Lives Matter is because, primarily it's because of sexism. People couldn't believe that Black women started something so big, so monumental. They were like, wait a second, are you sure there's no Black men behind this? Or are you sure there isn't like a white puppet named George Soros making everything happen? Like, there are these ideas about what we've done and how it's impossible that we've done it. And all I will say to people who believe in those conspiracies, all you have to do is look back at history. And you can look back at Fannie Lou Hamer, and you can look back at Ella Baker, and you can look back at all of the women who are also a part of the beautiful civil rights movement, who were the architects of that movement. And then you will probably have a different idea of what is happening right now.
Dr. King, I want to also talk about another group here that was so instrumental in the civil rights movement and how you see the role today, and that's within the faith community. Obviously, that's something you well know of and rooted in. And are we seeing a reimagining of how the faith community can be involved in this movement right now as well?
Wow. You know, this is a question I struggle with because I've had this analysis in the last few years about the institutional faith community and its failure to truly represent its faith in culture. And I think that's part of what we see now is the tension and what appears to be a rejection by a generation of what people have called the church. And I choose to see it as a person and people, a group of people who express the higher plane of who God made us in society. And so my hope and prayer is that people who have identified themselves as a part of a religion will see their greater responsibility, like my father did, and those that were part of that movement, to be a part of this global movement for humanity, for all marginalized people. Especially those of us in the Christian community. I mean, Christ constantly connected with those that were marginalized. He constantly crossed lines and boundaries and violated what was tradition and what was practiced, and just exemplified this is the higher way that we're supposed to live. And so this movement has to have that kind of breath and life in and through it. And in order for it to be successful, even though my father was a Christian, and many of those who helped to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with him were Christians, I would say most importantly, they were very spiritual people. And any movement that's going to transform the kind of world that we live in is going to take people who are very spiritual, because we're dealing with a lot of evils that are trying to destroy who we are as human beings with great value and great dignity. And so, yes, I would say in that way, faith, more so for me, spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Dickens, I asked you earlier about the reconciliation as it relates to white folks wanting to be a part of the movement. Now you get the question, because this is an area that you're an expert in. Is there a reconciliation within the Black community that needs to happen in order to all be on the same page as we fight for this outcome of social justice? If we're talking about how the faith community, the LGBT community, the different classism that exists in the Black community, what's the reconciliation process in that regard?
Right, yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's important that we engage in self-care, right? And what we all are experiencing is not only this COVID-19 pandemic, but this racism pandemic. And that as it relates to racial trauma, right? This race-based stress. And so there are a lot of different resources out there in order to help us in some ways strategize around this racial trauma. And in 2015, the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture developed this racism recovery plan. And so it just lists out different ways in which individuals can help people of color help, kind of manage this racial trauma. And so one of the things that it mentioned is that it's important to think about the early signs of racial trauma. So when you're experiencing a racist event, or when you are viewing a Black or brown person getting murdered by the police, what are some of your emotions or feelings and where is it happening? And then also other suggestions may be that help people cope with different types of stressors, such as a racial stressor, is journaling or mindfulness meditation. There's a lot of different types of meditation apps, such as Headspace or Insight, but then also seeking out a therapist, and particularly a therapist, though, that is culturally competent, right? A therapist that will be able to recognize the racism if a client is expressing something that they experience, but then also that they can help their client know how to respond to a racist incident.
So we've talked about allyship. We've talked about reconciliation within our community. We've talked about strategy. We've talked about intergenerational coming together. So we talk about how do we build on the momentum of this moment. And Professor Dickens, I'll stay with you. Based through your lens now, based on what you're seeing, are we building on this? Is there something going left or right that you're noticing? I mean, we're in an election year, so people say, well, that's the power right there. That's where you begin. But are we building on the momentum right now, this moment?
I think we are. I think on one hand, I see that there have been other movements that have come out of the Black Lives Matter movement. So for instance, it's been this movement or hashtag shutdown STEM to look at the ways in which racism is infiltrated within the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And in other movements as such. But also I see at the same time, it does feel like because of this climate that there has been more blatant forms of racism, where before we saw that it was more subtle, such as microaggressions, but now we're seeing more blatant forms of racism, more hate crimes, lynchings. And so I think there is this polarization where there is momentum being built, but also at the same time, there are injustices still not being met.
Sophia, what about you? This moment, and are we building on the momentum that we need to? Is there something that is struggling for you as you see how this current movement is progressing?
I think one thing that I am worried about is if momentum is actually being built upon. I think that a lot of what I see is a lot of social media advocacy, a lot of hashtags and posts and Black squares and what have you. And I think that one thing that's really important, and I'll borrow this from Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote this piece entitled "The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted," that it's very important that people differentiate the difference between social media being a tool and being a vehicle for change, right? And so social media does amazing things. It makes the world so small, and people can, know about protests and learn about different things through short posts or, tweets. But how much does, just hashtagging somebody's name or captioning a picture and then at the end saying, by the way, Breonna Taylor's killers are still not incarcerated, or whatever it may be. How much does that really do? And I think it does more harm than it does good. And I think that it desensitizes people in a way that I think in general, my generation is pretty desensitized to racial violence, because we've watched, Trayvon Martin died when I was maybe like 12. And so we've been seeing all of that in our most formative years, seeing this constant video sharing of Black death. And so how much does sharing those things and having those hashtags actually provide a movement? And I don't think that it fuels it very much at all. And so I want to make sure that especially my generation is being really intentional about coming out from behind their smartphones and from social media and engaging with content, and even more so for white folks, to not think that allyship can be performed through the phone. it's a job 24/7. You have to put in a lot of work to undo the cognitive dissonance. And you know, Professor Dickens talked about this as well. It's like to actually be an active anti-racist, it takes a lot of work. It's you hashtagging or making a post doesn't actually do that work for you. And so I want this momentum to continue, but I think that people might be more optimistic that it is than what reality actually illustrates.
Thank you. You know, the great thing about being a moderator is that I don't have to ask all the questions because we have some questions from the, 500 people that are watching this. So I want to go ahead and make sure we get some of their questions in. This first one comes from Jocelyn, who wants to know, what do men need to do to better support Black, cis, and trans femmes? How do we speak to educate Black men who don't acknowledge their own misogynistic, attitudes? Or Dr. King, I'll let you address that. What do men need to do better to support Black, cis and trans femmes? And I'm assuming it's in this movement.
Yeah, and Patrice probably is better able to answer that question.
Well, that's true too.
But yeah, but I would probably say everything starts with education. It starts with, you know, going inside and with a community and seeking to understand them. Without that, it can't happen. It's the same thing that whites need to do in our community. So I think that's one of the most important things. And I'm going to toss it to Patrice because she probably would be able to better answer it than me.
Let's kick it to Patrice.
No, I think that's correct. I think education is key. I think I love this question. It's a thoughtful question. It's an important question. I think that Black men need to confront other Black men. I think we have to start with allowing ourselves to intervene. The first sign of a misogynistic remark or transphobic remark in your friend group shouldn't be tolerated. Every chuckle that happens when men are making sexist or transphobic remarks leads to, that's being a bystander. And so I think the idea of being a bystander has to be interrupted. I think that men are trained to often respond to Black women by catcalling, Black trans women often by threatening them. And so all of that has to be interrupted. I think how we present ourselves, being an example to other men around how you interrupt and what you say is acceptable and what's unacceptable, I think is really important. And then trying to have those hard conversations. We always ask white people, talk to your cousins, talk to your aunties. We ask them to do that hard work. We need Black men to do that hard work with each other too. Should not be left to Black women or Black trans women to do the labor of reminding you how to respect us. That should be labor that is pushed by other Black men. A good example of that is someone out of Southern California in my hometown of Los Angeles named Richie Reseda. He started a program called Success Stories when he was in Soledad State Prison. And in that program, he was looking at wanting to identify how to stop patriarchy and how to challenge patriarchy in his friend group. And arguably, he was in one of the most patriarchal places, which was a prison setting. But he made that intervention because he identifies as a feminist. And so there's a CNN documentary that you can watch called The Feminist on Cell Block Y. And his identity has really been built around how to challenge men, especially men of color, around their patriarchy and its impact on women.
And here's a question actually from Professor Ed Vanderbilt, who, and we sort of touched on this in that first question, but we can certainly revisit it again. And that is, what are the intergenerational insights that are needed from one generation to the next? And we think about baby boomers, and I'm a proud Gen Xer. No one ever talks about Gen X. Y'all just leave us out the conversation. They'll never ask us what we think. But how do we make sure that we are receiving insight from all these amazing generations, these different groups? Professor Dickens, I'll let you start with that one.
Sure. I think it's important, just like what we're doing now, to have more of these forums and spaces to have these conversations across different types of generations. And then also we can have these conversations within our own family. And I think it's important to be able to, in essence, just to provide the space to have these conversations, because I think sometimes, as Sophia was mentioning, it may just be happening on social media, but well, since now we have to do it virtually, but I think we just need to be a little bit more intimate in the ways in which we're having these type of intergenerational conversations.
Sophia, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes people think that they have to be these constant, really private conversations. And while lots of times they do, I think that also it's, being intentional about just kind of, if somebody says something, say grandma is saying something that she just doesn't understand about this, and then rather than just being like, oh, whatever, actually saying, well, actually, this is what my opinion is, grandma, and I respect your positioning, but my lived experience, is different from yours, right? And I think that it can be sometimes intimidating for younger people, especially to approach topics of race with older folks and talking about things. It can be almost what I went through back in my day situation, right? Rather than I can borrow information from my experience and you can borrow information from your experience to further inform how we meet as a cohesive unit in this moment, and how we can work to serve the revolution that is, being cradled and created today, right?
Here's a question.
Can I add just a piece, Rose?
Sure, absolutely.
I want to add this smidgen of information. I think it's important too, especially those in my generation. I happen to fall on the very back end of the baby boomer generation, that we have to be consummate students and learners. I think sometimes when you get to a certain age in life, you feel like you know everything and you have everything to teach and nothing to learn. And that was the beauty of my father, even though he didn't get to be, my age, but he was always engaging and open to learning from other people, even people that, he did not agree with. And so I can appreciate what Sophia said is, we all have different experiences regardless of our age. And if we just open ourselves up to be learners, we can receive something from anybody.
And here's something we haven't really touched upon, and that is, this is an election year, voting. Here's a question. Someone says they're extremely concerned about voter suppression this election year, and they want suggestions on what individuals can do to make an impact on making sure everyone who can vote will vote. And let's keep in mind, we're in a pandemic. And I know this is something that the King Center, you are always instrumental in. So Dr. King, I want you to answer that one. How do we mobilize people to get out and vote?
Yeah, I think each one of us have to take it as our obligation to ensure that other people are voting, making sure that people have their absentee ballots if they're not comfortable going to do early voting, getting with as many people as possible and doing whatever is necessary for those who will participate in early voting and going to the polls together. A lot of times we sit back and take for granted that somebody else is doing it and taking care of it. But if we each saw it as our own responsibility or obligation to influence those that we have connection with in our various communities, then we can make a difference in this regard and do what people did last time, expose where we see the suppression going on. I think what I like about this generation is they are very good at exposing injustice and evil and wrongdoing. They will not let you get away with it.
They will cancel you in a minute. If you get a hashtag cancel, you done.
I have a challenge on that, but that's a whole nother conversation. But they certainly will expose it, and it has to be exposed, because if it's not, then we can't address it. And so those are the things, be prepared to expose what you see, be prepared to be active in getting as many people out to vote, making sure people have what they need, and do not take for granted that there's somebody else handling that. You see yourself as a part of the solution.
And I want to wrap with something that we haven't talked about. I think Sophia did mention it, and that is doing this work and that it is exhausting. And how do you know that this work is for you? Sophia talked about it's easy to be a keyboard activist, typing and putting a hashtag and canceling folks. But when you really want to commit yourself to doing this work, I want each of you to talk about or give your words of wisdom to people about what it means to do this work and to be committed. And Sophia, I'll talk about you. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think for me, I knew at fairly a young age that I wanted to commit my life to doing this work. And I think I've had to learn at my very old age of 21 that there's a pace at which you have to do it. I think that burnout, and I'm sure, Patrice Cullors could talk about this way more than I could, but burnout is a very real thing. And I think that if you're taking it upon yourself for this work to be your life's work and your service and the footprint that you're leaving on society and on the world, even if not recognized, that you have to really take care of yourself. And I also think that for me, one thing that I've been working on is I think it gets easy to get caught up in the moment and not making sure that you're constantly being like a lifelong learner, that you're constantly putting yourself in new situations to learn different things from different people and being kind about not knowing all of the things all of the time. I think that that's really important. I think sometimes people that do this work stay in like their lane, and in doing so miss intersections and cross sections, and that just goes into my encouragement of this radically intersectional lens, is that staying in your lane all the time isn't necessarily helpful for the movement. And it's definitely, I don't think, helpful for self-growth. And so those are the things that I would really encourage.
Professor Dickens, what about you?
So for me, I got interested in this work and probably started off as my experience as a student at Spelman, but then transitioning to graduate school in Colorado, that was culture shock for me. And from there, I really started to see more. I started to experience what I learned about at Spelman. And so from there, I started this like self-love work, I call it, in terms of looking at the ways in which Black women are experiencing gendered racism and coping with experiencing gendered racism. And one of the things, as I'm kind of nearing into my still early to mid career, is that you have to, as Sophia mentioned, self-care is so important as a psychologist. And I've had my fair share of almost having feelings of burning out. And so recognizing, now I know before I get to that point, so it won't happen. But then also I realized along this life commitment work that I am a part of is finding spaces that are inclusive, that support you and uplift you. And I'm glad to be back as a faculty member at Spelman, where I'm able to do the research on Black women, and I'm not questioned for the type of research that I do. And then also I realized that it's important to have community. It's so important to have community that I don't think I would have ended up where I am today and doing the work that I'm doing if I didn't have a supportive group of family and friends around me. So all those things help me continue to do this life commitment work to social injustice.
And Patrice, what do you want folks to know about being committed to doing this work?
Oh, so many things. One thing I wasn't prepared for was the level of attacks that we would experience as folks who did this work. I think Bernice knows the severe consequence of doing this work. And that I was not prepared for. I wasn't prepared to have, white supremacists go after us. I wasn't prepared to be labeled a terrorist. And that kind of, I think that kind of thing is actually really important for young people to learn, is that while the work that we're doing is amazing and important and necessary, that it poses a great threat to white supremacy and an old archaic order. And that security and safety is really important. It's not stuff I thought about when I first started Black Lives Matter. Why? I didn't have to think about, I didn't know I had to think about things like that. And so we've learned a lot about security in the last 7 years, both physical and also cyber security. Did I know that there was going to be Russian bots hacking our social media to interfere in an election? Had no idea. Did we know that we were that important, to be used as a pawn for elections? Had no idea. And so I think especially for a younger generation where almost everything we do lives online, security is so important. And cybersecurity in particular is so important. And we can't take it for granted that the work that we're doing isn't scaring an old establishment that they are really holding on to, with both hands and claws and feet, like they're really trying to hold on to this old order. So that sounds a little bit doomsday, but I wish someone would have told me, like, hey, guess what? This is now entering the territory of needing to be secure. And this is what security looks like. So I want to pass that information on to this generation, because that also helps, that having more cybersecurity and physical security and understanding it more has helped me in my mental health. It's really scary when you don't know who's attacking you and why and where it's coming from. And I didn't know about Breitbart. I didn't know about these sort of right-wing entities that were seeing us as targets. And so having more information has really helped me in being able to figure out the ways to protect myself and the people that I love has really helped me.
Patrice, thank you so much. I understand, I know you have to leave right at 6, so I want to go ahead and thank you so much. But Dr. King, you'll get the last word about what people should know about the importance of doing this work, and if you're going to be committed, be committed.
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say, just to answer your question about, is it for me? I would say that every human being has a responsibility to be a part of making this a more just, humane, equitable, peaceful, and sustainable world. Back to my mother's quote, you win it in it and you earn it in every generation. You as an individual may want to opt out, but your generation is called to. And so although everybody has that responsibility, some people are going to opt out. And those of us that are part of it have to understand that change never occurs with the masses. It occurs with a few dedicated minority people who have a mentality that I'm going to transform this system, no matter what it takes. And in that process, recognize that you may not change everything because there's something that's going to be left behind for another generation. So don't feel overwhelmed if there's 10 things you're going after and only 3 happen. My father, was trying to get to economic inequities and started along that path and could not complete it. And it's okay if you have given your all in this process, and everything that everybody said in terms of self-care, that's critical, in terms of, drawing from other generations, that's critical in terms of understanding, people that are going to try to sabotage, undermine, infiltrate, threaten, and all of that kind of stuff. When you nonetheless have given your all, that's what you have to have peace with. You can't worry about whether this person is doing this or this person is doing that. You stay focused on your assignment, your responsibility, and know that Even though it's not everybody, there's enough of a cadre of individuals who are in this with you, including a cloud of witnesses, and that you will make a difference if you continue to stay focused and understand that you are part of bending that arc that my father talked about, the moral arc of the universe that's long and bends towards justice.
Wow, thank you all so much. We could go another entire hour. I want to thank all of you and of course the audience. Now listen, the next Spelman Speaks will be Tuesday, August 25th. So please visit spelman.edu for more information, and please continue the conversation on Twitter. Be kind using the hashtag Spelman Speaks. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for the words of wisdom. Thank you for the comfort and the peace and the space. And thank you, Spelman College. Have a good evening, everybody.
Don't you let nobody turn you around, turn you around, turn you around. Don't you let nobody turn you around. Keep the straight and the narrow way. Don't you let nobody turn you around, turn you around, turn you around. Don't you let nobody turn you around. Keep the straight and the narrow way. 'Twas at the river Jordan baptism was first begun. John baptized the multitude, but he sprinkled not a one. Oh, my Lord, don't you let nobody turn you around, turn you around, turn you around. Don't you let nobody turn you around. Keep the straight and the narrow way.